move on to learning new concepts on databases, we are going to have to recap some of the stuff that we learned in grade 11. So what we're going to do is we are going to take a quick look at a database structure, the tables, the records, the field properties, forms, queries, reports, and calculations in reports. Just remember, grade 12s, that a database is made up of tables, queries, forms, and reports. All the data that you input in a database is stored in a table, and just like Excel, it consists of columns and rows, but in this case the columns are fields and your rows are the records that you are going to keep in your database. So let's have a look at this. Here is your field. So your fields are ISBN, title, author, etc. And your records are the actual ISBNs and the title of the books and the authors that gets typed into your database. Your basic field properties is where you are able to do input, masks, captions, default values. This is where you can do your data validation to make sure that your input is correct. And then the second thing we're going to look at is forms, and forms is just a user-friendly way of inputting data into a database. And unlike a table where you see all your records at the same time, in a form you only see one record at a time. So now there are very basic data validation techniques that we can use to make sure that the data that we put into our database is accurate, because we've got to remember the GIGO principle. Remember the GIGO principle, grade 12, it's garbage in, garbage out. So in a little bit later we are going to look at input masks, default values, selection lists, and validation rules. We are going to look at basic queries, creating a simple report, and a very simple calculation in a report. So let me show you what it looks like in an actual database. So this database consists of a table, a query, a form, and a report. And if I open my books table, it gives you the records that have been inputted. And if I go to design view, it gives you the data type for each field, and it shows you your properties over here. So I'm going to close it. I'm going to open the form. If you look at your form, just like I mentioned earlier, you can see one record at a time. It's just a user-friendly way of inputting data into a database. And if I look at a query, we use a query to extract specific information, if you remember grade 12. And in this case, we are extracting all book prices that are lower than 150. And if I run my query, it comes up with only 2 books that are under 150. And then we are going to take a quick look at the report that I created. And a report, basically grade 12s, is a printout of a table. And it just puts it into one view for you, similar to a form. So that basically is the things that we did in grade 11. We're now going to look at some of those concepts in more detail, and we are going to start with data validation. Okay, looking at data validation. We use data validation grade 12 to make sure that the input we put into our databases is correct. So we're going to start with the data type. Your data type controls the type of data a user inputs. Now you know from last year that you can have text, numbers, currencies, dates and times, yes, no fields. All that helps or leads towards more accurate input. Field sizes can be altered so that if you only want 10 characters typed in a particular field, you can alter the field size so that only 10 characters can be typed in. We have input masks, we have lookup lists, and we have validation rules and text. Okay, let's look at the more practical aspects, grade 12s. We are going to start with an input mask. Now, an input mask allows a user to only type in specific things that you can set. For instance, for contact, we are going to put in an input mask of 10 zeros, which will make sure that the data capturer has to type in 10 zeros when typing in a cell phone number. So in the properties field for the input mask, I'm going to type in 10 zeros, and that will ensure that your data capturer types in 10 numbers. If you are not sure about an input mask, there are ways of accessing the input masks. If you are in the input mask in your database and you press the F1 key, which is the help key, it comes up with the access help. You can click on the combo box input mask property, and what it does for you is, if you scroll down, it gives you the character you can use in your input mask and what the description is for each character. So for instance, if you wanted compulsory letters to be typed in, you would use a capital L. If you wanted compulsory digits to be typed in, just like we did for our cell number, you would use a 0. If you wanted digits or space, you would use an hash key. And if you look down a bit further, the less than sign ensures everything is typed in lowercase, and the greater than sign ensures that everything is typed in uppercase. And grade 12s, there's no need to go and learn this whole table off by heart. It is accessible, and it's even accessible during your exams. So it's a good idea to practice accessing it. Okay, that is our input mask. So now we're going to look at default values. And what a default value is, grade 12, it is a value that you type in that will appear on every single person's record. So for instance, if for country, we all came from the same country, and in the default value I typed in South Africa, for every single record that you type in, it will come up with South Africa automatically, so you don't have to retype it again. Another data validation that you can use is a selection list. And what a selection list is, a list that's been previously typed in that the data capture just needs to choose an item from. So to add a selection list, all you do is you go to the field where you want your selection to occur. You click on look up, and where it says text box, instead of text box, you are going to choose either list box or combo box, because they both have the same or similar function. And then in the row source type, it is always a value list. And the row source is where you type in your own values, and the values can either be separated by a comma or a semicolon. So in this case, I'm going to just separate them with a comma, and I'm going to type in snowstorms, flooding, drought, earthquake, tornado. And once you're done, you can just close your table to save it. So I just want to show you what it looks like. So now if I go to my table and I go to danger, it allows me to choose from a list that I've created previously. So in that way, we are reducing the number of errors that can be made. Let's go back to our table. So we've looked at lists. Another thing you can do is you can add a required field. You can make your required field yes. Now what that means, grade 12s, is if you change the required from no to yes, it means that who's ever inputting the data cannot leave that field blank. If you try and get past that field, it's going to give you a message to say that you can't carry on because the field has to be filled in. So it's quite a good thing to remember when creating a database, to make sure that your required is on yes. And then another validation rule that we can use are actual validation rules. Now, what validation rules are, it's almost like a function that you type in, and if the wrong item is typed in, you put in the message that must appear if the wrong thing is typed in. So what I'm going to do for gender is I'm going to say that the data capturer has to type in an F or an M. Okay, so an F for female and an M for male. And then the text that must come up if it's wrong is I'm going to say type only F for female or M for male. So now if I close my table and save it, and I open my table, and I go and type in a new record, and I actually try and type in the word male, it's not going to let me. You can see it's come up with the message that I put in, type only F for female or M for male. So if I now only leave the M in, it will allow me to go to the next field. So that's our basic data validation. In the next thing we're going to do, grade 12s, is we are going to create and design reports that are grouped. Right, grade 12s, let's look at designing a report and grouping a report. Last year in grade 11, you just created a report without grouping or sorting, and this year we are going to create a report with grouping and sorting. So it's quite easy to create a report. We are going to go to create. We always use the report wizard to create a report. I am going to base my report on the table called sponsors. I would like to use all the fields. Then I'm going to click on next. And it's in this step that it says, do you want to add any grouping? And yes, I do. I want to group it by type. So all you need to do is double click on type, and you'll see it's put a little heading at the top. Then you can click on next. And the next thing is, do you actually want to sort it? And you can choose by how you want to sort it. I'm going to choose surname. I'm going to say next. Next again, it's going to ask us to give our report a name, and I'm going to call it sponsors report. And I'm going to choose finish. So if you look at the finished report grade 12s, you can see I have business at the top, and it's sorted alphabetically by surname. And then if I go to the next page, you will see it's sorted by private. And it's again sorted the surnames alphabetically. So that's basically how you group and you sort a database. Now, why do we sort and group a database? Well, it's quite simple. It's if you want to add functions in your group headers or your group footers. Before we move on to adding calculations to our group headers or footers, grade 12s, I want to show you how to group in a report that has already been created. So what you need to do is go to the report. You're going to right click and go to design view, and then in the grouping and totals group, you are going to click on group and sort, and you're going to click on add group, and then it comes up with all the fields that you have, and all you do is you click on the field that you want grouped, and it'll tell you it's grouped on type. Then you can also add a sort. So I'm going to click on add sort, and I want it sorted by surname, and it tells me now that it is sorted by surname. So let's have a look at what it looks like. We now have a type header, and if I scroll down, you will notice that there's a page footer and a report footer, but I want a type footer in which to put a function. So now to get a type footer, what I do is you are going to click on the arrow next to more, and then where it says without a footer section, you're going to click on the drop down arrow, and you're going to choose with a footer section. So now if you have a look, I have a footer section, I have a type header, and I have a type footer. And if you remember from grade 11, you can only put a function in the report footer, and that works the same. You can only put a function in a type footer or a type header, not in the detail and not in the page footer. So if we actually wanted to go and count the types of sponsors that we have, we would have to put it in the type footer. So I'm now going to add a function into my type footer. And remember grade 12s from last year, there are just 6 or 5 basic functions that you can use in a database. And that is sum, min, max, count, and average. And the one thing you've got to remember when you're using average is not to type out the whole word average, but just to type in equals AVG. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a group footer that will calculate however many sponsors we have according to the type. Okay, we are going to add a function to our type footer, and how we do that is we are going to go to design, and in the controls, remember you have to select the text box. So I've selected the text box. I'm now going to drag it out in the type footer, and remember grade 12s that it comes up with text and unbound. Now in the text part, that is where you are going to type the label for your function, and in this case I'm going to type in number of sponsors, and in the unbound part is where we are going to type in our function. Now we're going to start with the equals again, and this time I am going to use the function count. Now grades 12s, you've got to remember that unlike Excel, there are no ranges to put in your function. So you have to use the field names. And remember that your field names are always typed in square brackets, and they are case sensitive. So you have to type them exactly the same way that they are typed in the actual field name. So I'm going to start off with a round bracket, then a square bracket, and I'm going to count sponsor. I'm going to close the square bracket and close the round bracket, and I'm going to go to data sheet view, and if I scroll down, it will tell me that the number of sponsors is 17 for that one, or 9 and 42. So it is added up however many sponsors there were according to type. So that is quite simple. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to add a function in the report footer. So let's go and do that. I'm going to go back to design view. Now you did this last year, grade 11, so this is grade 12, so this is actually just revision. Remember, you need to make your report footer area wider. And I'm going to go back to my controls and my text box. I'm going to drag out so that I can do my function. And I'm going to do total number of sponsors. And I'm going to use count. This time I'm going to use a different kind of count. And I think it only works for count grade 12s. Instead of typing in the actual field name for count, you can type in an asterisk, the little star in brackets, and it does the same function. So now if I scroll to the very end of my database, it tells us that the total number of sponsors is 68. So that's basically putting a function in a group, grade 12s. The next thing we're going to look at is adding calculations to queries. Before you can do a calculation in a query, you have to have created your query. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a quick query based on term 1 marks. So once again, you always use the query wizard when you create a query. We are creating a simple query, so you say OK. We want our query based on term 1 marks, and we are going to use all the fields. We are going to give our query a name. You can leave it as the default name if that makes sense to you, and then we are going to choose finish. And here's our query. Now, unlike in a report, there is no report footer or query footer in which to put your calculation. So what we have to do, grade 12s, is in design view, we are going to add a new field. So I'm going to go to design view. And in this example, what I'm going to do is we are going to work out the difference between the first test and the second test. So I'm going to click in the first blank field that I have. And the first thing you do is type in the field name. So I'm just going to call it mark difference. Once you've typed in the field name, it has to be followed by a colon and a space. Now, we are going to put the field names in square brackets, just like we did with the calculations in the report. And I'm going to subtract test 1 from test 2. what you have to remember, grade 12s, is that it's case sensitive and it has to be typed exactly the same way as it's been typed in the field name. So once I've put in my field and I've done my calculation, I'm going to run my query. And if you look at the query, it'll come up with the mark difference over here. So that's quite easy. I'm going to do another one for you, just with a different calculation. This time what we're going to do is we are going to calculate a percentage, and I'm going to say test 2 was out of 35, and then we will calculate the percentage. So once again, grade 12s, we are quickly going to create a query. I'm going to base it on learner marks. I want all the fields. No, I don't want test 2. I'm going to call it percentage calculation, or just percentage, and I'm going to say finish. So now I'm going to go to design view of my percentage query, and in the first empty field I'm going to type in my new field name followed by a colon and a space, and I'm going to take test 1 and I'm going to divide it by 35 because that's what the test is out of. I'm going to run my query and it'll give you a percentage. Now, this has not been formatted to a percentage. So if you want to format it to a percentage, this is what we do. We're going to go back to design view. I'm going to right click on my field and I'm going to go to properties. And in the property sheet next to format, I am going to choose percent. And I want 0 decimals. I'm going to close this and I'm going to run my query, and now it has converted those numbers into percentages. So that's quite simple, grade 12s. Do you agree how to add a query how to add a calculation to a query? So now we are going to move on to more complex queries and creating more complex queries. Okay, before we move on to creating those more complex queries, we need to learn about operators that we can use in these queries. So the basic operators that we can use in a query are OR, AND, NOT, and NULL. So let's look at the OR operator. When criteria is used using an OR, it means that the criteria must match one of 2 criteria, and only then will the values be displayed. So if you look at my example, you will see that we are looking for restaurants in Beach Road or restaurants at Club Mykonos, and the result showed you all the restaurants in both of those, Beach Road or Club Mykonos. So now the NOT operator actually speaks for itself. If criteria is entered with a NOT in front, then any record with a value that is different to the value specified will be displayed. So if you have a look at my example, in my criteria I've said not restaurants, and the result has come up with everything but a restaurant. Okay, let's look at wildcards. We have used wildcards before when we've searched for files, and we know they are represented either by an asterisk, a question mark, or a hash. So let's look at the asterisk first. The asterisk represents 0 or more characters like star, hotel, star. So what that will bring up, grade 12s, is everything with the word hotel in the middle. Okay? The question mark represents a single character. Example, if we had to type in like, B-E-D-R-O-O with a question mark, it is only going to find one letter after the word bedroom. Okay? The hash represents a single digit like 00 hash. Okay, let's have a look. In my example, I said like accommodation asterisk, and in the result it has brought up everything starting with the word accommodation, and then anything after the word accommodation comes up as well because of the asterisks. Is null brings up all records that have no entries in them. Okay, so that is null. It's going to bring up every record that is blank. So if you look at my example, under themed party stock, I typed in is null, and it's brought up everything under sets of that does not have anything in it. You can see all those cells are blank. Okay, obviously is not null is then the opposite of is null, and it'll bring up everything that is not blank. So if you look at my example, I said is not null under cell number, and it's brought up everything that does not have a blank cell. So now grade 12s, let's go and look at all of this stuff practically. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go and create some queries with you, trying to use all the operators we have just learned. So remember, we go to create. We always use the query wizard. It's a simple wizard. I'm going to use all of the fields. And just to help us, let's say we are going to do this query for names with S. And I'm going to choose finish. Now remember, grade 12s, that you have to type in the criteria you want before a query is actually valid. Because as you can see from this result, it has brought up all the records. So I'm going to go to design view, and in design view is where you type in your criteria. So under learner, as in my query's name, I said names with S. I'm going to type in like S with an asterisk. That means it should bring up all the names starting with the letter S. So I'm going to run it, and it has. It's brought up 3 names, and they all start with the letter S. So that's using a wildcard. Okay, let's go and create another query, and we are going to choose, let's work with null this time. Let's create a quick query again. We're going to base it on our table. We want all the fields. I'm going to call it is null. And I'm going to go to design view. And under health status, I'm going to type in is null, so that it brings up everybody that does not have a health status, and I'm going to run it. And you can see from the result that it's brought up 4 people who do not have a health status. So that is null, which is quite simple. I'm not going to do is not null with you because it's just the opposite of is null, and that's quite simple to do. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to look at the OR operator. I'm going to create a quick query again. I'm going to base it on my table using all my fields. And I'm going to call it OR query. And let's go to design view. Okay, let's put in a query where our BMI is going to be between 19 and 23, and with people who train for 20 minutes or train more than 20 minutes. So in the criteria row of BMI, I am going to type in 19, and underneath it I will type in 23, and then for training time I want 20 minutes. And I'm going to run my query. And it has only come up with one person who has a BMI of 19 and trains for 20 minutes. So that grade 12s, if you have a look, is how we use the OR, because I've typed the 23 in the OR. And under training time, because you have a criteria under OR, you have to type in the same training time as you have in the top row, because we wanted people with BMIs of 19 or 23 that train for 20 minutes. So that's using the OR operator. Okay, and that grade 12s is basically covering most of the operators we looked at before. We've covered null, We've covered the asterisk, which is our wild card, and we've covered the OR. The next thing we're going to look at grade 12s is looking at creating a database according to a specific scenario.